The departure hall of the Caltharian palace was beautiful in that specific way that powerful civilizations used architecture to remind visitors they were somewhere important. Soaring crystalline arches, floors that seemed to be carved from single pieces of stone that shouldn't exist, light fixtures that weren't fixtures at all, but somehow captured and redirected the planet's triple suns into gentle illumination. Ambassador Daniel Cross had spent 2 years walking these halls, and he still found them intimidating. Today, standing surrounded by carefully packed luggage that contained 2 years of his life, he just wanted to leave. His formal departure credentials sat in his inner jacket pocket, signed by both Earth's Foreign Service and Queen Silthara's office. All the proper documentation proving his diplomatic mission was complete, his rotation finished, his service to humanity's galactic integration fulfilled. The transport shuttle waited on the platform beyond the massive doors, crew already aboard, engines running through pre-flight checks. In 6 hours, he'd be at the orbital station. In 3 days, aboard an Earth vessel heading home. In 2 weeks, eating his sister's terrible cooking and sleeping in his old bedroom and walking on soil that humanity had evolved on. He was ready, more than ready. Exhausted in ways that went beyond physical tiredness. The exhaustion of maintaining perfect diplomatic composure for 2 years, of representing an entire species to an empire that saw Earth as an interesting curiosity at best, of negotiating agreements where every word mattered because one mistake could set back humanity's position in galactic politics by decades. Ambassador Cross. Daniel's stomach dropped before he even turned around, because he recognized that voice, formal, precise, carrying authority that made the air itself seem to straighten its posture. Queen Silthara stood 10 meters away, flanked by guards who wore ceremonial armor that was definitely not ceremonial, and her expression was the same unreadable mask he'd faced across negotiating tables for 24 months. "Your Majesty," Daniel said, executing the proper formal bow that Caltharian protocol demanded. "I was just preparing for departure. Thank you for." "Your departure authorization has been revoked," Silthara said, and the words landed like a physical blow. Daniel straightened slowly, trying to process what he'd just heard. "I'm sorry, what?" "Your presence is required for ongoing negotiations." Silthara moved closer with that gliding walk that made her seem to float rather than step. She was tall, most Caltharians were, with silver-white skin that reflected the hall's light in subtle patterns, and those distinctive long ears that marked her royal bloodline swept back from her skull like elegant weapons. Her eyes were obsidian black, polished to the point where they seemed depthless, revealing absolutely nothing. "Earth's interests demand your continued service. You cannot leave at this time." "That's," Daniel stopped himself before saying impossible, because clearly it wasn't impossible if it was happening. "Your Majesty, with respect, my mission objectives are complete. Trade agreements signed, cultural exchange programs established, all documentation filed with both our governments. My rotation schedule has me returning to Earth for debriefing and reassignment. There are no ongoing negotiations requiring my specific participation. Circumstances have changed," Silthara said with the kind of finality that ended discussions in her court. "New complications have arisen regarding the technology transfer protocols. Your expertise is essential to resolution." "What complications?" Daniel asked, his diplomatic training kicking in despite growing alarm. "The protocols were finalized 3 months ago. Both sides accepted the terms. What possibly could have?" "Technical matters that require diplomatic finesse," Silthara interrupted. "Matters that I will brief you on once you are settled in your new quarters." "New quarters?" Daniel's voice cracked slightly on the second word. "Your Majesty, I don't need new quarters. I need to board that shuttle and return to Earth according to agreed-upon diplomatic rotation schedules." "The schedules have been amended." Silthara gestured, and 2 guards moved to flank Daniel's luggage. "You will be accommodated in the palace proper while these negotiations proceed. more convenient than the diplomatic residence, given the intensive nature of the work ahead. Daniel felt reality tilt sideways. This wasn't a request or even an order framed as a request. This was a queen informing him of decisions already made, arrangements already implemented, his autonomy already overridden by someone with the power to do exactly that. "I need to contact Earth's Foreign Service," he said, forcing calm into his voice. "My government needs to be informed of this change in circumstances. Communications will be restricted during the sensitive phase of negotiations," Sulthara said. "Standard security protocol for diplomatic matters of this nature. There is no standard protocol for detaining ambassadors against their will," Daniel said, and saw something flicker in those obsidian eyes, too fast to identify, immediately suppressed. "You are not detained, ambassador. You are fulfilling your diplomatic obligations." Sulthara's tone remained formally polite, but something in her posture had gone rigid. "Earth assigned you to facilitate cooperation between our civilizations. That cooperation requires your continued presence. Surely your government will understand the necessity. They'll understand that their ambassador is being held without clear justification by a foreign power," Daniel said. "Your Majesty, I invoke diplomatic immunity under the Galactic Convention on." "You are on Caltharian sovereign territory," Sulthara cut him off, and now there was steel in her voice. "Operating under agreements between your government and mine that give me discretion regarding the duration and scope of diplomatic missions. I am exercising that discretion. Your immunity protects you from criminal prosecution, Ambassador Cross, not from being required to complete your assigned duties." Daniel stared at her, really looked at her for the first time since she'd entered the hall. Saw the careful control in how she held herself, the tension around her eyes despite the neutral expression, the way her hands, usually graceful and relaxed, were clasped behind her back where he couldn't see them. This wasn't the Sulthara he'd negotiated with for 2 years, coolly logical, open to persuasion through well-reasoned argument, willing to compromise when presented with mutually beneficial solutions. This was someone holding position through sheer force of will, defending something with authority rather than logic. "What's really going on here?" Daniel asked quietly. "Because this isn't about technology transfer protocols. There are no new complications. You're inventing justifications for keeping me here, and I don't understand why." For a moment, just a moment, Sulthara's mask slipped. He saw something in her expression that might have been desperation, quickly buried beneath royal composure. "You are needed, ambassador. That is sufficient reason." "Needed for what?" Daniel pressed, sensing weakness and exploiting it like any good diplomat. "If there are genuinely urgent matters requiring my attention, brief me. Show me the complications. Let me evaluate whether my presence is actually essential or if you're—" He stopped, because finishing that sentence would be calling a Caltharian queen a liar to her face, which would be both diplomatically catastrophic and potentially fatal. Sulthara seemed to understand what he'd left unsaid. Her expression closed completely, became the blank royal mask he'd seen in formal audiences. "Your new quarters are in the East Wing, 3rd level. Guards will escort you. I expect your attendance at tomorrow's morning briefing." "And if I refuse?" Daniel asked. "If I walk out those doors and board that shuttle regardless of your orders?" "Then my guards will prevent your departure," Sulthara said flatly, "with whatever force is necessary to ensure your safety and compliance with diplomatic requirements." The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken implications. Daniel felt his hands clench into fists, forced them to relax. "So I'm a prisoner?" "You are an ambassador fulfilling his obligations," Sulthara repeated, but her voice had gone quieter. "Please, Daniel," she stopped, seeming startled by her own use of his first name. In 2 years, she'd never called him anything but Ambassador Cross. "Please what?" Daniel asked. "Please do not make this more difficult than it must be," Sulthara said, and there was something in her voice he couldn't identify, something that sounded almost like pain. "The quarters are comfortable. You will have access to palace resources. This is not punishment or imprisonment. It is simply necessary." "For what?" Daniel demanded again. Silthara looked at him for a long moment, and Daniel saw her internal struggle written in micro-expressions that her diplomatic training almost concealed. Almost. Then she turned away, moving toward the exit with that gliding stride that never faltered. "Escort Ambassador cross to his quarters," she told the guards without looking back. "Ensure he has everything required for comfortable accommodation. And inform the gate authority that all departures are suspended pending further notice." She left, and Daniel stood in the departure hall surrounded by luggage. He wouldn't be loading onto a shuttle, staring at doors that might as well have been solid walls for all the chance he had of getting through them. The guards moved forward, polite, professional, absolutely immovable. "Ambassador, if you would come with us, your belongings will be transferred to your new rooms." Daniel took one last look at the platform beyond the hall, at the shuttle that would be leaving without him, at freedom slipping away into impossibility. Then he followed the guards deeper into the palace, into quarters he hadn't asked for, into a situation he didn't understand. As they walked through corridors he'd thought he knew, Daniel replayed the encounter in his mind, analyzing every word, every gesture, every micro-expression that had escaped Silthara's control, and kept coming back to that moment when she'd called him Daniel, when her voice had gone soft and almost pleading, when her mask had slipped just enough to reveal something underneath that looked disturbingly like desperation. He'd spent 2 years learning to read Caltharian diplomatic signals, learning to identify when Silthara was negotiating in good faith versus political theater, learning the subtle tells that indicated her real position beneath the formal rhetoric. And what he'd seen today terrified him, because it suggested this wasn't about diplomacy or politics or galactic strategy. It suggested something far more complicated, far more personal, and far more dangerous than any diplomatic crisis he'd been trained to handle. The guards stopped at a set of doors carved from some dark wood analog that probably grew on one of Kelthara's moons. "Your quarters, Ambassador. The Queen has assigned you accommodations befitting your essential status to ongoing diplomatic efforts." They opened the doors, and Daniel stepped into rooms that made his previous diplomatic residence look like a supply closet. Vast spaces filled with Caltharian artistry, furniture that somehow combined alien aesthetic with surprising comfort, views through floor-to-ceiling windows that showed gardens extending toward distant mountains. It was beautiful. It was luxurious beyond anything Earth's foreign service would have authorized. It was absolutely a prison, regardless of how comfortable the bars. Daniel stood in the center of rooms he'd never asked for, staring at luxury he'd never wanted, trying to understand how his completed diplomatic mission had just become indefinite detention at the whim of a queen who'd looked at him with something that might have been desperation, or might have been something even more concerning. His luggage arrived moments later, unpacked by staff who moved with efficient silence. His credentials, worthless now, sat in his jacket pocket like a reminder of freedom he'd been counting on. Outside the windows, Kelthara's triple suns painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, beautiful, alien, and suddenly feeling very far from any possibility of home. Daniel sank into a chair that adapted to his frame with uncomfortable precision, and started planning how exactly he was going to handle being held by someone powerful enough that no authority in the known galaxy could overrule her decisions. Someone who, for reasons he desperately needed to understand, had decided that letting him leave was not an option she could accept. 3 days passed in what Daniel was starting to think of as luxurious purgatory. His new quarters were indeed everything the guards had promised, comfortable beyond reason, stocked with amenities he didn't need, connected to palace networks that gave him access to libraries and entertainment systems, and basically everything except communication with anyone beyond Caltharian borders. His messages to Earth's foreign service vanished into bureaucratic void. His attempts to reach the orbital station were met with polite system errors. He was connected to everything and isolated from everyone who mattered. The guards outside his door were unfailingly polite. They'd escort him anywhere in the palace he wished to go, the gardens, the libraries, even the court observation galleries. They just wouldn't escort him to the spaceport or let him leave palace grounds or permit any action that might result in his actually departing the planet. It was maddening. What made it worse were the summons. Every morning, an aide would arrive with a formal request for his presence at various meetings, briefings, or consultations. Daniel would attend, prepared to address whatever urgent diplomatic crisis supposedly required his continued presence. Instead, he'd find himself reviewing trade documentation that didn't need reviewing, consulting on cultural exchange programs that were functioning perfectly well without him, or sitting through policy discussions that had nothing whatsoever to do with Earth's interests. It was busy work. Elaborate, time-consuming busy work designed to create the appearance of necessity while accomplishing nothing substantive. And Silthara was always there, presiding over these pointless meetings, asking his opinion on matters that didn't require it, maintaining perfect formal courtesy while steadfastly refusing to acknowledge the absurdity of the situation. On the fourth morning, Daniel decided he was done being diplomatic about it. The meeting was in one of the smaller council chambers, just Silthara, 3 of her senior advisors, and Daniel supposedly there to review proposed amendments to agricultural trade classifications. 20 minutes into what should have been a 5-minute discussion, Daniel set down the data tablet he'd been pretending to read. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice cutting through an advisor's droning explanation of grain categorization protocols. "May I speak candidly?" Silthara's attention snapped to him with that unnerving intensity she'd perfected. "Of course, Ambassador, your candid assessment is valued." "Then I'll be candid," Daniel said, standing because sitting made him feel at a disadvantage. "This meeting is unnecessary. These amendments don't require my input. They're internal Caltharian policy adjustments that I have no authority to influence. I'm here because you've invented a reason for my presence, just like yesterday's session on mining regulations that somehow needed Earth's perspective, and the day before's discussion of educational reforms that had nothing to do with our cultural exchange programs." The advisors exchanged glances, uncomfortable, knowing glances that suggested they saw the same thing Daniel did, but weren't about to challenge their queen. Silthara's expression remained perfectly neutral. "Your perspective as Earth's representative provides valuable outside viewpoint on matters that don't concern Earth," Daniel interrupted, which was probably treasonous or at least spectacularly rude in Caltharian protocol. But he'd stopped caring about protocol somewhere around day 2 of captivity. "Your Majesty, I've spent 2 years learning to read between lines of diplomatic language. I know when I'm being managed. So please, explain to me what's actually happening here. Why am I really being kept on Calthara?" Silence filled the chamber. The advisors looked at their queen, waiting for her response. Silthara sat perfectly still in her high-backed chair, and Daniel watched emotions flicker across her face too quickly to identify, except one, visible for just a moment before she suppressed it. Something that looked disturbingly like panic. "Ambassador Cross," she said carefully, "perhaps this discussion would be more appropriate in private." "Why?" Daniel challenged. "Is there something about my detention that needs to remain secret from your own advisors?" "You are not detained," Silthara said, but her voice had lost its usual certainty. "Then I'm free to leave. Right now I can walk out of this chamber, proceed to the spaceport, and board the next transport to the orbital station." "The situation is more complex then." "It's a yes or no question, Your Majesty," Daniel said. "Am I free to leave or not?" Silthara stood, and the movement was so abrupt that her advisors actually flinched. "Senior advisors, please excuse us. Ambassador Cross and I will conclude this discussion privately." The advisors couldn't leave fast enough, practically fleeing the chamber with relief at escaping what was clearly about to become a very uncomfortable conversation. The doors sealed behind them with a soft hiss of pressure locks, leaving Daniel alone with a Caltharian queen who looked less regal and more cornered by the second. "Daniel. Ambassador Cross," he corrected coldly. "Since we're apparently maintaining professional formalities while you hold me prisoner." "You are not a prisoner," Sulthara said, but the words sounded hollow even to her. "Then what am I?" Daniel moved closer, using every centimeter of height he could claim even though she was still taller. "What do you call someone held against their will, denied communication with their government, prevented from leaving through threat of force? Because in human legal systems, we call that kidnapping. I'm curious what Caltharian terminology you prefer." "I call it necessary," Sulthara said, and there was heat in her voice now, the first genuine emotion he'd heard from her since this started. "I call it essential. I call it something I cannot adequately—" "I have ruled Kalthara for 11 years, she said quietly. "Before that, I commanded military campaigns that brought 3-star systems under our protection. I have negotiated treaties with species whose biology I barely understood, made decisions that affected billions of lives, carried responsibilities that would crush most beings under their weight." She turned back to face him, and something in her expression had shifted. The mask was still there but cracking visibly now. "I have never had difficulty making decisions, Ambassador, even difficult ones. Even choices that cost lives or resources or political capital. I evaluate options, determine optimal strategy, and execute without hesitation." "And yet," Daniel prompted, because clearly there was more. "And yet I cannot seem to let you leave," Sulthara finished. "I approved your departure authorization 3 weeks ago, signed the documentation myself, watched the date approach with full knowledge that your mission was complete and your rotation schedule demanded your return to Earth." Her hands clenched at her sides, the first truly uncontrolled gesture he'd seen from her. "And with each passing day, the idea of you actually boarding that transport became less acceptable, more intolerable." Daniel felt something shift in his understanding of the situation. "Why?" "I do not know," Sulthara said, and the admission seemed to cost her. "Which itself is unacceptable. I am Caltharian royalty, trained from birth to understand my own motivations, to control my responses, to never act from unclear impulse. But here I am, having revoked your departure against all logic and protocol, holding you here against your will and mine, because the alternative, the idea of you leaving, causes something in me that feels distressingly close to panic." She moved away from the windows, pacing now in a way that suggested agitation poorly controlled. "You spent 2 years here, Ambassador. 2 years of daily briefings and weekly formal dinners and constant negotiation sessions. 2 years of your presence in my court, your voice in my council chambers, your perspective on matters that I could technically decide without you, but found myself consulting you on anyway." "That's called diplomatic cooperation," Daniel said, but his voice had lost its edge. "It's what ambassadors do." "Is it?" Sulthara stopped pacing, faced him directly. "Is it normal for a queen to schedule additional meetings simply to hear an ambassador's opinion on internal matters? To find excuses to extend briefing sessions because the discussion was engaging? To notice when that ambassador is absent from court and feel as though something essential is missing?" Daniel's mouth went dry. "Your Majesty, during the Veridian trade negotiations last year," Sulthara continued, her words coming faster now like a dam breaking, "you suggested that creative solution to the currency conversion problem. The one that satisfied both sides even though conventional wisdom said compromise was impossible. I presented it as my own idea to my council, but it was yours. Do you remember what I thought in that moment?" "No," Daniel said quietly. I thought that I had been solving impossible problems alone for 11 years, and here was someone who could see solutions I missed, who thought in ways that complemented rather than simply agreed with me, who challenged my assumptions without disrespecting my authority. Her voice had gone softer, almost wondering, and I found myself wanting more of those moments, scheduling more sessions where you might offer that perspective, manufacturing reasons to keep you in my presence, because something about the way you think makes everything seem less difficult. You're describing professional respect, Daniel said, but even to his own ears it sounded uncertain. Valuing a capable colleague's input. Am I? Silthara moved closer, close enough that he could see the faint luminescence beneath her skin, the biological marker of heightened Caltharian emotion. Then explain why I declined 3 suitable marriage proposals from neighboring systems this year. Because the idea of formal partnership with anyone felt wrong in ways I could not articulate. Explain why I have dreaded your scheduled departure for months, knowing it was coming and finding myself inventing increasingly desperate reasons why your mission should be extended. Explain why standing in that departure hall watching you prepare to leave felt like losing something I did not know I needed until faced with its absence. Daniel stared at her, all his diplomatic training failing to provide adequate response. You're saying you have feelings for me. I am saying, Silthara corrected, that somewhere in 2 years of professional interaction, you became essential to my daily existence in ways that transcend diplomatic utility. I look forward to your presence in briefings. I value your opinion beyond its strategic merit. I find myself thinking about our conversations long after they end, wondering what you would think about situations you are not present for. She stopped, seeming to hear her own words, and something like horror crossed her face. And I apparently have no ability to process these feelings in any rational manner because my response was to simply refuse to let you go, to trap you here through abuse of royal authority, because I lack the courage to admit what is happening or the wisdom to address it appropriately. The silence that followed was profound. Daniel tried to organize his thoughts, found them scattered beyond retrieval. 2 years of professional interaction, 2 years of careful diplomatic distance, formal meals, policy discussions. 2 years during which he'd thought he was simply doing his job, representing Earth competently, building necessary working relationship with a powerful alien queen. He had not noticed, had not let himself notice, that he'd started looking forward to briefing sessions with her, that her rare smiles felt like diplomatic victories worth celebrating, that debates with her were intellectually stimulating in ways civilian work had never been. That somewhere along the way, she'd stopped being Queen Silthara, Caltharian ruler, and become someone whose opinion he actively sought, whose approval he unconsciously worked to earn, whose presence made even tedious diplomatic functions somehow worthwhile. This is insane, he said finally. Yes, Silthara agreed, completely. You're holding me prisoner because you have a crush you didn't recognize and don't know how to handle. That is a remarkably reductive summary of an emotionally complex situation, but essentially accurate, Silthara said. And now that I have admitted it aloud, I am forced to confront how absolutely inappropriate my behavior has been. You came to my world to perform diplomatic service. You completed that service admirably. And your reward is being detained by someone who cannot articulate why she needs you here, but apparently needs it desperately enough to override your autonomy, violate diplomatic protocols, and potentially destroy any personal regard you may have developed for her during our working relationship. She moved back to her chair, sat with visible effort at composure. I apologize, Ambassador Cross, sincerely and without reservation. You are correct. I have been inventing justifications, manufacturing necessity, and generally behaving in ways that would disgrace my crown if made public. You deserve better treatment than I have provided. So let me go, Daniel said. Silthara flinched as though he'd struck her. Yes, of course, That is the correct course of action. She stood, moved toward her desk, activated a communication panel. I will reinstate your departure authorization immediately. Contact Earth's Foreign Service to arrange transport as soon as. Wait, Daniel said, and was surprised to hear himself say it. Silthara's hand froze over the panel. Yes. Daniel struggled for words, found himself saying something he hadn't planned to say. I need to understand. 2 years, Silthara. 2 years of working together, and you never gave any indication that you viewed me as anything other than a diplomatic necessity. If you felt these things, why didn't you say something? Why wait until I was literally leaving to suddenly decide you couldn't let me go? Because saying something would have required acknowledging I felt something, Silthara said simply. Caltharian royalty is trained to view personal attachment as potential weakness. I was taught to form alliances, strategic partnerships, marriages of political convenience, not to develop feelings for a human ambassador whose presence was always intended to be temporary. She turned to face him fully. I told myself what I felt was professional respect, that I simply appreciated competent diplomatic work, that the reluctance I felt about your departure was merely regret at losing a capable colleague. I continued telling myself these comfortable lies until you were standing in that departure hall with your credentials ready, and suddenly, all those lies became inadequate to explain the panic I felt at the idea of you leaving forever. So you improvised badly, Daniel said. Very badly, Silthara agreed. With results that have damaged whatever regard you might have held for me and compromised our professional relationship beyond any possibility of repair. She touched the communication panel. I am authorizing your immediate departure. No restrictions, no further delays, and I am formally apologizing to you and Earth's Foreign Service for my inappropriate handling of this situation. I will accept whatever diplomatic consequences result, though I suspect my council will be more concerned with my emotional instability than with any political fallout. Silthara, please go, Daniel, she said quietly, using his first name again. Before I make this worse than I already have, I would like to retain at least a small amount of dignity in your memory, and if you stay longer, I will probably find new ways to demonstrate that even queens can be foolish when faced with feelings they do not understand how to process. Daniel stood in the council chamber, staring at a woman who had just torn apart her own composure to give him the freedom she'd taken, and discovered he had absolutely no idea what he wanted to do with it. The next 48 hours were among the strangest of Daniel's diplomatic career. Silthara, true to her word, had removed all restrictions. His communications were restored, his departure authorization reinstated, Earth's Foreign Service contacted with explanations that were diplomatically phrased but essentially amounted to, your ambassador was detained due to my personal confusion, sincere apologies. The transport shuttle was rescheduled, new departure time set for the following morning. Daniel should have felt relieved. Instead, he felt unsettled in ways he couldn't articulate. He packed his belongings methodically, arranged final affairs, prepared official reports that avoided mentioning the actual reason for his delayed departure, because Alien Queen developed unrequited attachment wasn't something that fit standard diplomatic incident forms. He went through all the correct motions while his mind circled endlessly around that conversation in the council chamber. The way Silthara had looked when admitting she couldn't let him leave, not imperious or commanding, but almost vulnerable, stripped of the royal mask she wore so perfectly during their 2 years of professional interaction. The way her voice had softened when calling him Daniel. The way she described feeling panic at his departure, manufacturing meetings to keep him present, declining marriage proposals because something about the idea felt wrong. The way he'd felt listening to her confession, not just anger at being detained, but something more complicated underneath that anger. Something that had been growing for 2 years without him acknowledging it, because she was a queen, and he was a diplomat and professional boundaries were supposed to prevent exactly this kind of complication. Daniel found himself reviewing memories he'd carefully filed as purely professional. Briefing sessions where debates with her had been the intellectual highlight of his work. Formal dinners where her rare smiles felt like victories worth earning. Policy discussions where he'd found himself eager to hear her perspective, curious about how her mind approached problems. Moments when he'd caught himself noticing things that had nothing to do with diplomacy. The way she moved, the precision of her gestures, the intelligence in those obsidian eyes when she was truly engaged in a discussion. He'd told himself it was simply professional admiration, respect for a competent leader, appreciation for someone who could match his diplomatic skill, normal working relationship dynamics. But if he was honest, actually honest in ways he'd been carefully avoiding, there had been anticipation before their meetings that went beyond professional interest. Satisfaction in making her laugh that had nothing to do with diplomatic rapport. Growing reluctance as his departure date approached that he'd rationalized as simple resistance to change. Maybe Silthara wasn't the only one who'd been lying to herself about what they'd become to each other. The morning of his rescheduled departure arrived with Kelthara's triple suns painting the sky in shades of amber. Daniel stood in his quarters, now properly cleared of all personal belongings, and stared at luggage that seemed heavier than it should be. A chime indicated someone at his door. Daniel expected palace staff, maybe final transport arrangements. Instead, Silthara stood there alone, without guards or advisors, dressed in simple court attire rather than formal regalia. "Your Majesty," Daniel said, executing proper protocol more from habit than conviction. "I didn't expect." "May I come in?" Silthara asked, briefly. "I know you have transport to catch, but I wanted to speak with you before you departed." Daniel stepped aside, let her enter quarters that suddenly felt much smaller with her presence filling them. She moved to the window, looking out at gardens she probably visited daily, but was examining as though seeing them for the first time. "I have been considering what to say," she began without preamble. "How to apologize adequately for my behavior, how to explain motivations I barely understand myself. I prepared formal statements, drafted official apologies, composed diplomatic language that might somehow express regret without revealing weakness." She turned to face him. "But I think you deserve honesty rather than diplomacy, Daniel, even if that honesty is uncomfortable for both of us." "I'm listening," Daniel said quietly. "I told you I don't understand why I cannot let you leave easily," Silthara said. "That was true. It remains true. But I have spent these past days examining my reactions, consulting my advisors, the ones I trust with personal matters rather than just political ones, and attempting to identify what exactly I am feeling." She moved closer, and Daniel noticed details he'd never let himself observe before. The way light caught in patterns beneath her skin, the subtle shifts in her ear position that indicated emotional state, the fact that she was nervous in ways that her perfect control almost but not quite concealed. "What I feel," she continued carefully, "is something my culture does not have adequate language for because Keltharian royalty traditionally does not admit to it. Attachment, dependence, the sense that someone has become essential to your existence in ways that transcend their practical utility." Her voice dropped quieter. "What humans call love, I think, though my understanding of your concept may be imperfect." Daniel's heart rate spiked, diplomatic composure dissolving entirely. "Silthara, I know it is inappropriate," she said quickly. "You came here as Earth's representative, not as someone available for personal entanglement with alien royalty. I know our working relationship was supposed to remain professional, that I held authority over your circumstances, that any feelings I developed were mine to manage without imposing them on you. I know all of this." She stopped, seeming to gather courage. "But I also know that watching you prepare to leave feels like losing something irreplaceable, and I have conquered star systems, commanded fleets, made decisions affecting billions of lives, and I apparently lack the strength to simply let you go without admitting what you have become to me. Which is, Daniel asked, his voice rough. Essential, Sulthara said simply. You have become essential to me, Daniel Cross. Your presence in my daily life, your voice in my counsels, your perspective on situations I face. The way you challenge my assumptions while respecting my authority. The way you make me laugh at observations no one else would voice. The way you see me as a person to understand rather than a title to appease. Her hands clenched at her sides. I have been alone since taking the throne 11 years ago. Respected, obeyed, occasionally feared, but fundamentally isolated by position and power. And then you arrived with your human directness and refusal to be intimidated and brilliant diplomatic solutions. And suddenly, I was not alone. I had someone who met me as equal, who engaged with me as person rather than position. Someone whose opinion I valued not because protocol required it, but because I genuinely wanted to know what you thought. She stopped, looking stricken. And now you are leaving, which is right and proper and exactly what should happen at the conclusion of diplomatic mission. And I apparently love you enough to have tried to keep you here against your will, which is neither right nor proper, and demonstrates exactly how poorly equipped I am to handle these feelings appropriately. The silence that followed was absolute. Daniel tried to process what he just heard, found his thoughts too tangled to form coherent response. Sulthara watched him with naked vulnerability. No royal mask, no diplomatic composure, just someone who just confessed something she barely understood and was clearly terrified by his potential response. I'm not going to pretend I know what to do with that information, Daniel finally said. Because I don't. This is so far outside my training or experience that I don't even know where to begin addressing it. I understand, Sulthara said quietly. I simply wanted you to know before you departed, wanted you to understand that my behavior, as inappropriate as it was, came from feelings I can barely articulate, not from simple desire to control or possess. And I wanted to tell you that I am sorry. For detaining you, for abusing my authority, for making your completed mission into something complicated and uncomfortable. You deserved better treatment from me. Sulthara, Daniel stopped, reorganizing thoughts that resisted organization. Can I ask you something honestly? No diplomacy, no careful phrasing, just honest question. Of course. If I hadn't been leaving, if my rotation hadn't been ending, would you ever have told me any of this? Or would you have just continued pretending it was pure professional relationship? Sulthara considered, then answered with visible effort. I would have continued pretending. Because acknowledging these feelings requires admitting vulnerability I was trained never to show. Because romantic involvement with Earth's ambassador would create diplomatic complications both our governments would struggle to address. Because, she paused, because I am terrified of caring about someone this much when I have responsibilities that might require sacrificing personal attachment for political necessity. That's honest, Daniel said. That's cowardly, Sulthara corrected. I have faced military campaigns, hostile negotiations, assassination attempts, and I apparently lack the courage to simply tell someone I care about them until forced by circumstances to either acknowledge feelings or lose them entirely. So what happens now? Daniel asked. Now you board your transport, return to Earth, resume your life, Sulthara said. This situation is resolved as it should have been from the beginning, with your freedom restored and my inappropriate feelings acknowledged but not imposed on you further. And you, Daniel pressed, what happens to you? I continue ruling, Sulthara said with attempt at lightness that failed completely. I attend council sessions, negotiate treaties, manage an empire. I do this as I have always done, alone, competently, without personal complications interfering with duty. Sounds lonely, Daniel said quietly. It is what I was trained for, Sulthara replied. What I chose when I claimed the throne. Personal happiness was never part of the bargain, Daniel. Power and isolation are traditionally paired among my people. Daniel looked at her, really looked at this woman who had just stripped away every defense to confess feelings she barely understood to someone she'd briefly imprisoned out of desperation, and discovered something that probably should have terrified him but somehow didn't. He didn't want to leave her like this. Didn't want to walk away from someone who'd become important to him in ways he'd been carefully not examining for 2 years. Didn't want to return to Earth knowing he'd left Silthara alone in her palace, dealing with feelings he'd helped create through simple proximity and professional competence. "I need to ask you something even more honestly," he said. "Go ahead," Silthara said. "Are you actually in love with me? Or are you lonely and I happen to be present and competent, and you're conflating professional rapport with romantic attachment?" The question was cruel, but Daniel needed to know. Needed to understand if what she felt was genuine connection or simply isolation finding focus on the nearest suitable person. Silthara flinched as though he'd struck her. Then slowly she answered, "I have wondered that myself, questioned whether what I feel is real or simply loneliness finding target. I have been alone for 11 years, surrounded by people who fear or respect me but never simply see me. You arrived and you did see me, challenged my Caltharian royal training does not emphasize emotional literacy in such matters. But I know what you have become to me goes beyond professional appreciation or loneliness-seeking focus." "What have I become to you?" Daniel asked. "Home," Silthara said simply. "Somehow, in 2 years of diplomatic interaction, you became the closest thing to home I have felt since claiming a throne that makes personal connection nearly impossible. And the idea of losing that, losing you, is why I behaved so inappropriately." Daniel processed this, his mind working through implications while his heart did complicated things in his chest. "I should be furious with you. For holding me here, for overriding my autonomy, for using your power to trap me." "You should," Silthara agreed. "And I will understand if you leave now hating me for what I've done." "I don't hate you," Daniel said quietly. "That's the problem." Silthara went very still. "What?" "I don't hate you," Daniel repeated. "And I should. What you did was absolutely not acceptable, violated every diplomatic norm, demonstrated that even you, brilliant tactician, respected leader, can make spectacularly bad decisions when faced with feelings you don't know how to process." He moved closer, watching her expression shift through confusion toward something that might be hope. "But I spent 2 years learning to read you, Silthara. Learning when you were negotiating in good faith versus playing political theater. Learning the subtle tells that indicated your real thoughts beneath diplomatic language. And what I'm reading now is someone who is genuinely sorry, genuinely confused about their own feelings, and genuinely terrified that they've destroyed any possibility of connection with someone who became important to them." "That's accurate," Silthara said, her voice barely audible. "And here's the thing I've been avoiding acknowledging even to myself," Daniel continued. "I'm going to miss you. Not just as a professional contact, but as someone I looked forward to seeing. Someone whose opinion I valued beyond its strategic merit. Someone who made even tedious diplomatic functions worthwhile because debating with you was intellectually engaging in ways civilian work never was." He stopped, forcing himself to finish the thought. "Someone I apparently care about more than I let myself notice until faced with leaving permanently." Silthara's ears tilted forward, shock and hope combined. "You care about me?" "Apparently," Daniel said. "Though I'm still processing exactly how much and what that means, and whether I'm just responding to your confession or acknowledging something I've been suppressing for longer than I want to admit." "What do we do with that information?" Silthara asked, and she sounded young suddenly, not like a queen who commanded star systems but like someone facing emotional complexity they weren't prepared for. "I have absolutely no idea," Daniel admitted. "Because even if we both have feelings, whatever those feelings actually are, the situation remains complicated. You're an absolute monarch who just demonstrated she might use that power inappropriately when emotionally stressed. I'm a diplomat whose job requires trusting that personal relationships won't compromise professional judgment. There are power dynamics and political implications, and the fact that we're from different species with different relationship models. All valid concerns, Sulthara said. But, Daniel continued, I also know that getting on that transport and leaving without exploring what this might be feels wrong in ways I can't articulate, and I suspect you feel similarly. I do, Sulthara confirmed, though I would not blame you for leaving regardless given my behavior. Daniel looked at her, this impossible woman who ruled an empire but couldn't figure out how to express personal feelings, who made catastrophically bad decisions when faced with emotions she didn't understand, and made his own catastrophically inadvisable decision. Tell Earth I need extended time for final reporting, he said. Arrange for me to stay another 2 weeks, not as prisoner, not as diplomat being detained, as someone choosing to remain to figure out what the hell this situation actually is. You want to stay? Sulthara's voice carried wonder. I want to understand what we are to each other before making irreversible decisions about leaving, Daniel corrected. Whether that's just professional respect that got confused with personal attachment, or something more substantial that deserves exploration before we permanently separate. That is remarkably reasonable given that I recently held you against your will, Sulthara said. It's remarkably stupid given all the excellent reasons I should leave immediately, Daniel countered. But apparently I make stupid decisions when faced with you too, so we're even. For the first time since entering his quarters, Sulthara smiled, not the polite diplomatic expression or the formal queen's acknowledgement, but genuine warmth that transformed her entire face. I will arrange everything. 2 weeks, no restrictions, genuine freedom to leave if you choose. And during that time we figure this out, Daniel said. Honestly, no royal formality, no diplomatic distance. Just 2 people trying to understand what they actually feel versus what loneliness or professional attachment might be making them feel. Agreed, Sulthara said. Then hesitantly, thank you, Daniel, for not simply leaving after everything I've put you through. Thank me after the 2 weeks, Daniel said. When we'll either have figured out we're meant to be together, or confirmed that what we felt was situational attachment and can part as friends. Either way, no more lying to ourselves about what we're feeling. No more lying, Sulthara agreed, and extended her hand in human gesture of agreement. Daniel took it, felt the warmth of her skin against his, and wondered if he just made the smartest decision of his career or the most spectacularly foolish. Probably both. That seemed to be the pattern with Sulthara. Outside, the transport shuttle waited, but Daniel wasn't boarding it. Not yet. Not until he understood what he was leaving behind if he chose to go. The 2 weeks Daniel had negotiated stretched into something remarkable and occasionally terrifying in equal measure. Sulthara kept her word about genuine freedom. His departure authorization remained active, communications unrestricted, no guards following him beyond normal palace security. He could leave any time. The fact that he didn't became increasingly significant with each passing day. They started carefully, both aware they were navigating unprecedented territory. Formal dinners became less formal, more conversational. Briefings became actual discussions rather than one-sided consultations. Sulthara showed him sections of the palace he'd never seen, her private library containing texts from conquered systems, gardens cultivated personally rather than by staff, observation platforms where she went to think about decisions affecting billions. Daniel discovered layers to her he'd never glimpsed in 2 years of professional interaction. The dry humor she hid beneath royal formality. The weight she carried from choices that had cost lives even when they were correct choices. Her genuine care for her people despite ruling through absolute authority. The loneliness that had shaped her since claiming a throne at an age when most beings were still figuring out who they were. She learned about him too, not just Earth's ambassador but Daniel the person. His family back home, particularly his sister who sent increasingly confused messages about why he wasn't returning on schedule. His background before diplomatic service, including the academic career he'd abandoned because he'd wanted to do something that mattered. His doubts about whether diplomatic work actually accomplished anything meaningful, or if he was just rearranging deck chairs while civilizations did whatever they wanted regardless of treaties. "You matter," Solthara said during one of these conversations, sitting beside him in her private gardens under Kelthara's triple suns. "The work you did here, the agreements you helped negotiate, the cultural bridges you built, that matters, Daniel. Earth's position in galactic community is stronger because you spent 2 years making my empire see humanity as partners rather than interesting newcomers." "You would have reached that conclusion eventually," Daniel said. "Perhaps. But your presence accelerated it, made it personal rather than strategic." She looked at him, and Daniel had learned to read the subtle shifts in her expression that indicated emotional state. What he saw now was something between affection and sadness. "That is what you do, Daniel Cross. You make things personal. You see individuals beneath positions, engage with people rather than just roles. It is why you are effective diplomat and why," she stopped. "Why?" Daniel prompted. "Why I fell in love with you," Solthara finished quietly. "Because you saw me as person rather than crown. You treated Queen Solthara as someone to understand rather than obey. And no one has done that since I claimed my throne." It wasn't the first time, she'd said, she loved him during these 2 weeks, but each time still landed with impact Daniel felt in his chest. Because she wasn't saying it lightly. Keltharians didn't do emotion casually, and Solthara especially had been trained to control and minimize feelings. For her to admit love meant something profound. The question Daniel was still wrestling with was whether he felt the same way, or whether what he felt was something else. Attachment formed through proximity and respect, attraction that came from intellectual engagement, care that developed from seeing someone's vulnerability. Were those things love? Or were they components that might become love given time? Or were they simply professional rapport enhanced by loneliness on both sides? "I need to tell you something honest," he said, and watched her brace as though expecting rejection. "I don't know if I love you, not the way you love me with that certainty." "I understand," Solthara said, though her ears flattened slightly, disappointment poorly concealed. "Let me finish," Daniel said. "I don't know if I love you, but I know I care about you. Know that the idea of leaving and never seeing you again makes my chest tight in ways that have nothing to do with diplomatic friendship. Know that I look forward to time with you in ways that go beyond professional interest. Know that when you smile at me like you're doing right now, it feels like winning something valuable." "That sounds remarkably like love," Solthara observed. "Maybe," Daniel agreed. "Or maybe it's the beginning of love. Or maybe it's care and attraction and respect that could become love given time and circumstances that actually let us explore relationship rather than just stolen moments between your royal duties and my increasing guilt about extending absence from Earth. Your government has been remarkably patient about your delayed return," Solthara said. "My government thinks I'm engaged in sensitive negotiations that require my continued presence," Daniel said. "Which is technically true if you consider figuring out whether I'm in love with an alien queen to be a negotiation." "Is it?" Solthara asked. "It's the most complex negotiation of my career," Daniel said. "Because the stakes are higher than trade agreements or territorial boundaries. If I get this wrong, I hurt you. If I get it wrong, I hurt myself. If I get it wrong, I damage diplomatic relationships between our peoples. No pressure at all. You could simply leave," Solthara pointed out. "Return to Earth, resume your career, consider these 2 weeks an interesting interlude that helped us both process complicated feelings. No one would fault that choice, Daniel. It would be the safe, reasonable path." "Safe and reasonable have never been my strong suits," Daniel said. Ask anyone who's worked with me. I'm the diplomat who suggests creative solutions everyone says won't work until they do. I take calculated risks based on reading situations and trusting my judgment about people. And what does your judgment tell you about this situation? Silthara asked quietly. Daniel looked at her. This brilliant, complicated woman who ruled an empire but couldn't figure out how to express personal feelings without tearing apart her own composure. Who'd made catastrophically bad decisions when faced with losing someone important to her. Who was capable of such vulnerability when she let down defenses her position required. My judgment tells me that you're genuine, he said. That what you feel isn't just loneliness finding focus, but actual connection with someone who became essential to you. My judgment tells me that I care about you more than professional relationship explains. That leaving now would mean walking away from something rare, before we've even had a chance to see what it might become. But, Silthara prompted, hearing his hesitation. But I'm also terrified, Daniel admitted. Of the power imbalance between us. You're a queen, I'm a diplomat whose authority ends at persuasion. Of the complications, two different species, two different cultures, two different relationship models. Of the fact that you've already demonstrated you might use your power inappropriately when emotionally stressed, which means I need to trust that you won't do that again, even though you have the ability to. Those are all valid fears, Silthara said. I know, Daniel said. Which is why I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Can you promise me that if we pursue this, whatever this becomes, you won't use your position to constrain my choices? That if I decide I need to leave, or take assignment elsewhere, or simply need space from you, you'll respect that without reverting to the behavior that started this whole situation. Silthara was silent for a long moment, and Daniel watched her process the question with visible effort. I want to promise that, she finally said. Want to give you absolute assurance that I would never again abuse my authority to keep you close. But I have learned through recent experience that my judgment fails when faced with losing you. That I am capable of making terrible decisions when panic overrides reason. That's not reassuring, Daniel said. No, Silthara agreed. But it is honest, which you asked for. She turned to face him fully. What I can promise is this. I am now aware of my tendency toward desperate measures when facing your departure. I have seen the damage that causes. To you, to our relationship, to my own integrity. I am working with my advisors to establish protocols that would prevent me from making similar decisions impulsively. And I can promise that if you tell me you need freedom or space, I will honor that even if it requires every ounce of self-control I possess. I cannot promise perfect behavior, Daniel, but I can promise genuine effort to respect your autonomy, even when it terrifies me. Daniel absorbed this, appreciating the honesty even if he'd hoped for simpler reassurance. Okay, that's fair. What about you? Silthara asked. Can you promise not to leave at first difficulty? Not to use Earth as convenient excuse to avoid relationship complications? To give this genuine attempt despite all the valid reasons it probably won't work? That's asking a lot, Daniel said. Yes, Silthara agreed. But if we're being honest about fears and requiring commitments, it should go both directions. I am risking my heart and dignity pursuing someone who has every right to reject me. You should risk something as well if this is to be genuine partnership, rather than me constantly vulnerable while you maintain escape routes. She was right and Daniel knew it. Fine, I promise to give this genuine attempt. Not to run at first complication or use career as excuse to avoid dealing with relationship difficulties. To actually try to build something with you despite all the excellent reasons it's complicated and inadvisable. Then we have our terms, Silthara said. We pursue this relationship honestly, respecting each other's autonomy, acknowledging our different power levels and working to prevent those from creating unhealthy dynamics. When you phrase it like that, it sounds like a treaty negotiation, Daniel observed. Is it not? Sulthara asked. We are two parties with different positions and interests, attempting to reach mutually beneficial arrangement. That is essentially what relationships are. Ongoing negotiations, where both sides try to meet needs while respecting boundaries. That is possibly the most Keltharian view of romance I've ever heard, Daniel said. Did you expect differently from a queen who barely understands her own emotions? Sulthara asked, but she was smiling. Fair point, Daniel conceded, then making another spectacularly inadvisable decision. Okay, let's do this. Let's actually try. I'll extend my stay on Kelthara indefinitely. Request assignment to permanent diplomatic liaison position or cultural exchange program or something that gives me legitimate reason to be here long-term. We'll date, or whatever Keltharians call courtship when it involves alien ambassadors. We'll see if what we have can survive beyond crisis circumstances and forced proximity. You're certain? Sulthara asked, and Daniel saw hope and fear warring in her expression. You would restructure your career, leave Earth semi-permanently, take a chance on relationship with someone who recently demonstrated poor judgment regarding your freedom. I'm not certain at all, Daniel said honestly. I'm terrified and probably making huge mistake, and definitely going to have complicated conversations with Earth's foreign service about my mental state. But I also know that walking away now means never knowing if this could have been something real, and I've spent enough time with you to want to find out. Sulthara's smile was radiant. I will make this work, Daniel. I will respect your autonomy, work on my control issues, and do everything possible to build relationship that honors both of us. I know, Daniel said, because if you didn't, I'd leave, and we'd both know I should. Fair terms, Sulthara agreed. They sat in the gardens as Kelthara's sons painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, two people from impossible worlds trying to build something that probably shouldn't work but might, just might, be worth the risk. 6 months later, Daniel stood in the newly established Earth Keltharian Cultural Center attached to the palace, reviewing proposals for student exchange programs, while Sulthara worked through diplomatic correspondence at the desk beside him. This had become their routine, working in the same space when possible, sharing tasks that overlapped, building both professional and personal partnership. It wasn't always easy. They'd had fights about his need for autonomy versus her instinct to protect and control. Arguments about the power imbalance that never quite went away even with both trying to address it. Difficult conversations about what relationship between their species even looked like when their biology and culture approached partnership so differently. But they'd also had moments of profound connection, late-night conversations that revealed layers neither knew they had, shared laughter over cultural misunderstandings, growing comfort with each other that came from choosing daily to build this impossible thing between them. Daniel, Sulthara said, not looking up from her correspondence. Your sister sent another message. She wants to know when you're visiting Earth and whether you're bringing that alien queen you're apparently dating to meet the family. She's direct, Daniel said. I like her already, Sulthara said, though the phrase that alien queen suggests she may not fully approve of your relationship choices. She thinks I'm insane, Daniel admitted. Most of my family does. They don't understand why I'd stay on an alien world for someone I met through diplomatic work. Do you? Sulthara asked quietly. Daniel looked at her, this woman who'd held him prisoner out of desperate fear, who'd torn apart her own composure to confess feelings she barely understood, who worked daily to respect his autonomy while fighting instincts shaped by absolute power, who'd become essential to his existence in ways he couldn't fully articulate but knew were real. I stay because you make me think harder, he said, because debating with you is intellectually engaging in ways civilian work never was, because you understand the weight of responsibility in ways most people don't, because when you laugh at something I say, it feels like winning something valuable. He set down the proposal he'd been reviewing. I stay because somewhere in 2 years of diplomatic work, and 6 months of figuring out how to do relationship across impossible differences. I fell in love with you. Took me entirely too long to recognize it, but yes. I love you, Sulthara. She went very still, her ears tilting forward in unmistakable joy. You have not said that before. I wanted to be sure, Daniel said. Wanted to know it wasn't just attraction or care or loneliness finding focus. But I'm sure now. This is love, complicated and difficult and requiring constant work to navigate our differences, but love nonetheless. Sulthara stood, moved to him with that gliding grace that still made his heart rate spike. I love you too. Have loved you since long before I had courage to admit it. Will love you through however many complications and difficult conversations and cultural misunderstandings our relationship requires us to navigate. She kissed him then. They'd been working on physical affection, learning each other's biology and preferences, figuring out how human Keltharian romance actually functioned beyond theory. It was still somewhat awkward, their anatomies not quite designed for perfect compatibility, but it worked. They worked. When they separated, Daniel smiled. My sister wants you to visit Earth, meet the family. Probably subject you to interrogation about your intentions toward her brother. Terrifying, Sulthara said. Absolutely, Daniel agreed. She's far scarier than any galactic leader I've negotiated with. You might face your greatest diplomatic challenge yet. I have conquered star systems, Sulthara said. I will manage one human sister. Your confidence is adorable and completely misplaced, Daniel said. But yes, let's plan a trip. Introduce you to my family, show you Earth, let you experience the planet that produced the diplomat who apparently stole your heart. You did not steal it, Sulthara corrected. I gave it freely, eventually. After making several catastrophic decisions about how to handle having feelings for the first time in my reign. She smiled. Though I maintain that if you had simply stayed imprisoned, we could have avoided much of this complicated emotional growth. Where's the fun in that? Daniel asked. An excellent point, Sulthara conceded. They returned to their work, professional partnership that had become personal relationship that enhanced rather than compromised professional collaboration. Building something unprecedented between their peoples, starting with themselves. Outside the windows, Kelthara's triple suns painted the sky in familiar shades of amber. Daniel had stopped thinking of Earth as home and this alien palace as assignment. Somewhere in the process of figuring out whether love was possible across impossible differences, Kelthara had become home, not because of the planet, but because of the woman who ruled it. The woman who'd been powerful enough to keep him but loved him enough to let him choose. And he'd chosen her. Every day, he chose her. Sometimes the greatest diplomatic achievements were the ones you negotiated in private, building futures with people who challenged and changed and completed you in ways you never saw coming. Daniel had come to Kelthara as Earth's ambassador, expecting to serve 2 years and return home with career advanced and mission complete. Instead, he'd found something infinitely more valuable. Partnership with someone impossible and brilliant, and worth every complication their relationship required. His mission was supposed to have ended long ago, but the most important missions he'd discovered were the ones you chose yourself. The ones that began with someone refusing to let you go and ended with both of you choosing to stay.